The article that I'd like to review today is one that was written by Bridget Vittrup and George W. Holden. It was published in the Journal of Applied Developmental Psychology in 2010, and it relates to my overall topic, which is corporal punishment and effective behaviour modification strategy in children. So the rationale for this research is really what appealed to me to begin with, and the authors assert that previous research has focused on parents' views of effective punishment, and ultimately children as the main recipients of the discipline have actually been left out of a lot of the conversation and research around what is the most effective method. So the aim of this research was to investigate children's views on punishment and for them to rate the effectiveness and fairness of a range of different methods. The hypotheses, there were 5 experimental hypotheses. The first was that the older children in the 8 to 10 years group will be less likely to select spanking as a fair and effective method than those in the younger age group in the study, so they were between 6 and 8 years. The second hypothesis was that overall children would select reasoning as the most fair, most effective and best overall option for punishment. The third was that overall children would select spanking as the least fair, least effective and worst overall option for punishment. The fourth, that children who have had a high exposure to spanking, which includes witnessing, will view spanking as a fair and effective form of punishment. And the fifth and final hypothesis was that children from families with a lower socioeconomic status would view spanking as fair and effective, and that no differences would be seen between African American and Anglo American children. There were 108 children who participated in the study, and they were between the ages of 6 and 10 years, and one of their parents. It was from a large city in Texas, USA, where 53% of the participants were African American and the remainder were Anglo American, and they were grouped into the lower and higher SES status. So the method used, there was 2 parts, a 2-part questionnaire for the parents. The first part was to obtain the SES data, and the second part was to ask them which types of disciplinary methods do they use in the home, and also the frequency with which they use them. Children, on the other hand, viewed four short videos that depicted a mother disciplining her son for the same type of misbehaviour. In it, there was, as I said, there was 4 different types of discipline used. There was spanking, there was timeout, reasoning, and withdrawal of privileges. So at the end of each of those short videos, children were asked 7 different questions to determine and rate the method's fairness and effectiveness. So they used a temperature scale, and it was pitched at an appropriate developmental level for the children to participate. The order of the sequence of videos did have a slight effect on responses, in that if spanking was viewed first, it was less likely to be rated as fair and effective as if it was viewed in the last sequence of videos. So the findings were that the first hypothesis was fully supported, in that the younger children viewed spanking as a fairer and more effective method than the older children in the study. The second hypothesis was somewhat supported, in that reasoning was ranked as the most fair, and it was also rated as the most effective in the long term, but it wasn't the best overall option for punishment, and that is because spanking was also a somewhat supported hypothesis, in that it was ranked as the least fair as expected, but it was actually rated as the most effective in the short term. So therefore, spanking was not the worst overall option for punishment. The fourth hypothesis was completely unsupported, in that children who had a high exposure to spanking actually viewed it as less fair and effective than those who had had a medium exposure. And those that had had a low exposure also had the same ratings of fairness and effectiveness, or equivalent to those that had had a high exposure. The fifth was also somewhat supported, in that there were no significant differences between African American and Anglo American children as expected, but there weren't any differences either between families and children coming from families with a lower to a higher socioeconomic status. Okay, so the conclusions really are that children are able to participate in this research and discussion around the effectiveness of different types of punishment, as long as it's pitched at a developmentally appropriate level. It really has implications for considering what are acceptable and appropriate forms of punishment to be used in the home, and certainly those that should be recommended for parents to engage in. The limitations, the major key limitation is that it was all a hypothetical research situation and not a real life scenario. So, opinions around the fairness of different methods and certainly the effectiveness of different methods you would imagine may differ in a real life situation. However, there's ethical implications in conducting research in a real life situation involving corporal punishment. So the relevance to the overall topic is that it does have relevance in terms of the perceived impact on behaviour in using corporal punishment. It also speaks to the long-term or the short-term effectiveness of this type of punishment, and also the level of exposure may impact upon children's levels of appealing to whether they think it's fair or effective as a method. In terms of other research, it complements well in terms of looking at the potential effectiveness of corporal punishment as a form of punishment, especially when you're considering a number of variables, and those would be the frequency with which it's used, the age of the child, the nature of the incident to which they're being disciplined, and also the timeliness of when the punishment has been meted out, I suppose. And it also has relevance to some other research which is looking and concerned with the impacts corporal punishment may have on children's overall behaviour.